His ordered bride stood taller than the driver and made the whole wagon groan. The first thing I heard before I saw her was the laugh. Somebody up at the head of the freight line let it go, a big wet bark of a laugh, and it carried all the way back to where I was standing beside my mule checking his near foreleg for a split hoof. I didn't look up right away. On a trail like that one, somebody was always laughing at something. A man slipped in the mud. An ox sat down and wouldn't be moved. A wheel came off. You learn not to look unless there was screaming involved. But then the laugh caught on. More voices, the kind of spreading sound a fire makes when it finds dry grass, and that made me look. The freight wagon from Ashcroft had come in that morning, and the driver was still up on his board. A stringy man named Pruitt who I'd known for 2 years and never liked. He was looking back over his shoulder at whatever was coming down from the wagon bed, and he was grinning like a man who had just heard the best joke of his life and was waiting for everyone else to catch up to it. Then she stepped down. She had to turn sideways to get through the canvas. She put her foot on the wheel spoke. The whole wagon shifted and the traces creaked, and she stepped down onto the ground of that camp with her carpet bag in one hand and a hat box in the other, and she stood up straight and looked around. She was the tallest woman I had ever seen in my life, taller than Pruitt on his board. Taller than most of the men in that camp by a full head. She was broad through the shoulders, deep through the chest, and she stood there in a gray traveling dress that had been made for a smaller woman and altered twice, and still wasn't quite right. Her hat was a small, sensible thing that sat on top of a quantity of brown hair she'd pinned up tight. She had a jaw like a Dutch door and hands that could palm a saddle. The laugh kept going. One of the Dutch freighters had tears running down his face. I had sent for her. Her name was Bridget Mao, and she had answered the advertisement I placed through an agency in Victoria 7 months before, and we had exchanged 6 letters, and she had agreed to come north to the Caribou country to be my wife. The agency had described her as of substantial and hardy constitution. I had thought that meant she was healthy. I walked through the camp toward her. The laughter was still going and she was standing in the middle of it, not flinching, not looking at the ground, just looking around at the camp and the mountains, and the sky the way a person does when they've arrived somewhere after a long journey and want to know what they've gotten themselves into. Not scared, just taking inventory. I stopped in front of her. She looked down at me. I am not a short man. I came up to her chin. I said, "You're Bridget Mao." She said, "I am, and you'd be the rancher." "Amos Holt," I said. "Mr. Holt." She shifted the carpet bag to her other hand and held the right one out, and we shook. Her grip was what you'd expect. Behind me, Pruitt called out to nobody in particular that he hoped I had extra timber to shore up the marriage bed, and several of the men laughed again, and a couple of them made other remarks that I won't repeat here. She heard all of it. She kept her eyes on me. I said, "You hungry?" She said, "Famished." "Come on then," I said, and I turned and walked toward my cookfire, and she walked beside me, and the laughter sort of fell away behind us. Not because anyone had the decency to stop, but because it's harder to laugh at someone's back than at their face. She ate 2 plates of the bean and salt pork I had going and drank 3 cups of coffee and didn't say much, just looked at the camp and the supply chain and the mule pen and the lay of the land like a woman calculating. I watched her without being obvious about it. She had dark eyes, very steady. A few freckles across her nose that the Victoria letters hadn't mentioned. Her hands around the tin cup were large and capable and did not shake. I said, "The agency said you worked on your family's farm." 30 years, she said. "Draft horses, dairy cattle, hay. My brothers are bigger than me." I said I doubted that. She said, "The middle one could have gone for a draft horse himself." I didn't laugh, but something in my chest loosened a little. I'd been on the Caribou run for 11 years by that point. I had my land claim up the valley, 160 acres of bench land above the river, a cabin I'd built myself, a spring that ran clean, and a kitchen garden that kept going feral on me because I didn't have time to tend it right. I had 4 good mules and a freight contract with the mining camps. I was 51 years old, and I had been alone since my first wife died of fever in the 3rd year we were on that land, and the years since had mostly been work and silence, and the particular kind of tiredness that isn't physical but gets into your bones anyway. I hadn't put the advertisement out because I was romantic. I put it out because I needed a partner. Somebody with a back and hands and enough stubbornness to hold a claim in that country when the weather turned and the work turned hard and there was no quit available. I had gotten exactly what I asked for. A preacher came through camp that same afternoon, a Methodist circuit rider who came through 4 times a year and was drunk for 2 of them, but he was sober that day. We were married in about 15 minutes, standing beside the mule pen, with Pruitt watching from a distance, and some of the freighters and 2 Sequapemc men from the Packers camp as witnesses. She said her vows clearly and without ornamentation. So did I. The preacher shook my hand, and accepted the bottle of rye I gave him and rode on. Pruitt said something from where he was standing. I said without turning around, "Pruitt, you say one more word and I will put your head through that wagon wheel, and I will do it in front of these witnesses, and I will not lose sleep." There was a silence. Then Pruitt got up onto his board and drove off. She was standing beside me. She said quietly, not making a thing of it, "You didn't have to do that." I said, "Yes, I did." She looked at me for a moment, then she picked up her carpet bag. "Show me the mules," she said. I showed her the mules. She went down the line of them with her hand on each neck, checking teeth, looking at hooves, running her thumb along a foreleg the way you do when you want to know if there's heat. She found the soft spot on the off hind of my lead mule before I'd gotten around to telling her he'd been favoring it. She pressed it gently, and the mule shifted, and she looked at me. "Bruise," she said, "not a split. He'll be fine in a week if you keep him off the heavy load." I said I'd been thinking the same. "But you weren't sure," she said. "No," I said, "I wasn't sure." She nodded, satisfied, and moved on to the next one. That was the first day. The ride up to the ranch took 2 days. We went in my wagon, her on the board beside me, the mountains coming in close on both sides as we got into the valley. She didn't talk much, and neither did I. She looked at the country. I could see her filing it away, getting the measure of it, the same way she'd measured the mules and the camp. Once, coming around a bend where the river ran fast over a gravel bar, and the spruce on the far bank were reflected clean in the flat water above it, she drew a breath and let it out slow. I said, "Beautiful country." She said, "Yes," then after a pause, "Hard country." I said, "Both." She said, "Both is fine." The cabin was what it was. I'd kept it clean, but it was a working man's place, not a woman's place. 2 rooms, a cold stone floor, a fireplace that pulled well but smoked a little in a north wind. The kitchen garden was a disgrace. I'd warned her in the letters. She stood in the doorway and looked at it without saying anything for a moment. Then she set down her bag and said, "I'll need better seed stock." I said I'd get it from the trading post in the spring. She said, "Garlic too. Can't make anything worth eating without garlic." I said I'd get garlic. She went inside and looked at everything carefully, and I stood in the yard and waited. She came back out and said, "It's a good fireplace." Like that was the thing that mattered most. I said my father had taught me to build a fireplace. She said, "He taught you right." We worked it out between us, the sleeping arrangement, without making it awkward. I had a cot in the second room I used for overflow storage, and I moved the storage and she took the main bed and I slept on the cot, and there was no conversation about it beyond the practical. That was fine. I hadn't expected otherwise. The first weeks were about learning each other's rhythms without getting in each other's way. She rose before me and had the fire going when I came out. She made good plain food, not fancy, the kind of food that holds a man through a hard day, thick oatmeal in the mornings, salt meat and biscuit in the field, bean soup in the evenings. She could lift things I didn't ask her to lift. She'd come out to the barn and find me wrestling a bale of hay into the loft, and she'd take the other end without being asked, and we'd heave it up together. The mule with the bruised hoof she kept her eye on. The week I was away on the freight run, she turned him out in the small pasture, and when I came back he was sound. I didn't say much about it. She didn't make me. The trouble came from down the valley, as it usually does. There were 3 brothers named Torrance who ran cattle on the flat ground below my bench. They were the kind of men the country made a lot of in those years, not outright bad, not outlaws, but mean in the small ways that accumulate into something that might as well be bad. They'd been pushing the boundary line between our land and theirs since I'd held the claim. Not by much. A few yards here, a fence post moved there. Enough to matter over time. I'd had 2 arguments with them already, the polite kind that ends with nobody satisfied, and I knew a third one was coming. It came about 6 weeks after Bridget arrived. The middle brother, whose name was Cal, rode up to my yard on a Tuesday afternoon when I was at the trading post. He told Bridget that the corner post on the east line was his family's property, and she was to stay away from it. And he said some other things besides, having to do with her size and her likely disposition, and the probable quality of our marriage bed. The kind of remarks that a man makes when he thinks he's talking to a woman alone, and there's no consequence. She didn't say much back to him, from what she told me later. She just watched him from the doorway and waited. When I came back and she told me what had been said, I sat still at the kitchen table for a minute. The lamp was going. She'd set a plate of beans and biscuit in front of me and was sitting across from me with her coffee, watching me the way she watched most things, steady and without performance. I said, "Did he touch you or come close?" She said, "No." I said, "Where exactly was he standing when he said it?" She pointed out the window toward the yard. I ate most of the plate. Then I said I was going to ride down to the Torrance place in the morning. She said, "I know." I said, "I want you to stay here." She said, "I know that too." Then she said, "Amos," I looked up at her, "don't start a war unless you mean to finish it." That was the most she'd said to me in one breath in all the weeks we'd been on that land. I looked at her for a moment, her dark eyes level, that jaw set, not afraid for herself, just thinking about the shape of what came next. I said, "I always mean to finish what I start." She held my eyes. Then she nodded once and went back to her coffee. I rode to the Torrance place at first light. Cal and the eldest brother, whose name was Roy, were in the yard. The youngest was somewhere I couldn't see, which I was aware of. I told Roy, clearly and without heat, that his brother had come onto my land and spoken to my wife in a manner that would not be repeated, and that if it was repeated, I would go to the land office in town and file the full boundary dispute I had been putting off for 3 years, which would cost the Torrances more than they'd spend in lawyer fees and surveyor fees and time what they gained by the corner post argument. And I said something else besides, which was between me and Roy Torrance and which I don't intend to repeat here. But he understood me. Roy looked at Cal. Cal looked at the ground. Roy said the matter would not come up again. I rode back without hurrying. When I came into the yard, Bridget was splitting wood. She had her coat off despite the cold, and she was working the axe with the kind of efficiency that comes from doing a thing 10,000 times. She heard my horse and stopped and looked at me. I said, "Done." She looked at me for another moment, then set the axe and walked over. She put her hand on my horse's neck, looking up at me from beside him. She said, "You're not hurt." I said, "No." She said, "Good." Then she went back to the wood. That was the moment I understood something about her. She hadn't sent me out of fear or pride. She hadn't expected me to be a hero about it. She just understood, the same way I did, that there is a kind of trouble you cannot let sit, and that a man who can finish what he starts is worth standing with. The hand on my horse's neck was not a grateful woman touching her savior. It was a partner checking on someone she needed sound. That's different, it matters more. Winter came in hard that year, as it does up there. Came in early and without apology. The first snow hit in October, and by November we were locked into our routines so tight that a day without something breaking or something dying or something needing attention was a day worth remarking on. We worked. We ate. We slept. We kept each other's company in the evenings without requiring much from each other beyond presence. She was a reader. I hadn't known that. She'd brought a small crate of books from Victoria that she'd been carrying in the freight wagon alongside her carpet bag, and she read in the evenings by lamplight with the same focus she brought to everything, moving through a book the way she moved through a task, completely, without skipping. I asked her once what she was reading. She said natural history, a man named Wallace, you'd like it. I said I doubted I'd understand it. She said, you're smarter than you think you are. She handed me the book. It was about the birds of the East Indies, which seemed about as far from where I was sitting as anything I could imagine. But she was right. I understood most of it. We read together on winter evenings, her at the table, me in the chair by the fire, and neither of us talked much, and it was the most comfortable I had been in years. Not soft comfortable, not relieved comfortable. Just the comfort of a house with two people in it who are working in the same direction. In February she got sick. Not dangerously sick, just a chest cold that went deep and hung on. She kept working for the first 2 days, which I put a stop to. I made her sit by the fire and I brought her tea with the wild ginger root she'd dried in the fall, and I took over the cooking, which was worse than hers, and she commented on this but not unkindly, and I tended the animals myself. On the 3rd day, she was restless and irritable from being still. I brought her the Wallace book, and she took it, but she kept looking at the window. She said, the milk cow. I said, fed and watered. She said, there was ice on the water trough yesterday. I said, broken, I checked it twice. She said, the hay in the. I said, Bridget. She stopped. I said, I've been running this place for 11 years. She looked at me. Something in her face shifted, like a hand releasing something it had been holding. She said, I know you have. She settled back. After a while she fell asleep in the chair, her head tipped sideways, her breathing rough but easier than the day before. I sat across from her and watched the fire and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. I don't have a word for it exactly. It's the feeling you get when something that was loose in you has been steadied, not fixed, not solved, just held. By March she was fully herself again, which meant fully at work again, and the first thing she did was replan the kitchen garden with a precision that suggested she'd been mapping it out in her head for the past 2 months. She drew it on paper. Rows, varieties, rotation. She showed it to me like she was presenting a military campaign. I said it looked well thought out. She said, I want chickens too. I said chickens were fine. She said, and a milk house, separate from the barn, the milk picks up the smell otherwise. I said I could build one in the summer. She said, I can help with the framing. I said I knew that. She looked at me, almost smiling. She said, you don't look horrified anymore when I say things like that. I said I was never horrified. She said, you were a little horrified in the beginning, when I helped with the bale. I thought about it. I said, surprised maybe, not horrified. She said, most men are horrified. She said it flatly as fact, not bitter, just accurate, the way she said everything. I said I needed somebody with hands. She said, you said that in the letter. I said I meant it. She was quiet for a moment, looking at her garden diagram. Then she said, I read those letters 3 times each before I answered the first one. I said, did I say something wrong? No, she said. You said something honest. You needed a partner for hard country, that's what you said, not a possession. Not a showpiece. She tapped the edge of the paper. I had 3 other advertisements I was considering. 2 of them wanted to know my measurements. I said that was no way to advertise. She said, no, it isn't. Then, yours said hard country and honest work and you'd be fair. She looked up at me. You have been fair. I said, you've held up your end. She said, I have. There wasn't much more to say. That was about the size of it. The Torrance business came up one more time in April when I was in town and ran into Roy at the general store. He said a few words about my wife, not disrespectful this time, just observational, that he'd seen her clearing the drainage ditch up on the north line in the cold, and she'd moved twice the rock he'd expected in half the time. He said it the way men say things about someone who has surprised them, not quite admiring, not quite comfortable, somewhere between. I said she was a worker. He said she is, then after a pause, she your equal, Holt. I thought about that for a moment. I said, she might have the better of me in some departments. He looked at me like he wasn't sure if I was serious. I was serious. He could see that eventually, and he nodded and let it go. That spring we planted the garden together, her plan, my labor alongside hers, and the garlic went in, and the turnips and the potato sets and a patch of late cabbage she said she knew how to preserve. The chickens arrived from the trading post in May, 8 of them, and she built the coop herself in 3 days with me passing her boards. The milk house went up in June. I did the heavy framing and the roof, and she did the interior fitting, the shelving and the drainage channel and the cold shelf cut into the north-facing bank. By midsummer there was a different kind of order to the place. Not neater, exactly, more complete, like a thing that had been built for a purpose it hadn't been quite achieving, and now it was. We ate better. The garden was a serious enterprise. The milk house kept the cream cold, and she made butter from it that the trading post took on consignment, and we had a small income from that by fall that I hadn't planned for. Small, but solid. The kind of thing that compounds. One evening in August, we were sitting outside after supper. It was warm enough to be out, the light long and pale, the mountains showing their summer color. We'd been working since first light, and neither of us had much to say. She had a cup of coffee and I had mine, and we sat there watching the light go. She said, Amos. I said, She said, are you satisfied with how it's turned out? I looked at her. She was watching the mountains, not me, her hands around the cup, the good jaw, the steadiness of her. I said, more than I expected. She said, what did you expect? I said, I expected a competent arrangement. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, that's what I expected too. I said, and? She turned and looked at me then. Those dark eyes level, giving nothing away that she hadn't decided to give. She said, and it's more than that. She said it plainly, the way she said everything, without decoration or performance. She wasn't confessing something soft. She was stating a fact that she'd worked out and decided I ought to know. I said, yes. She looked at me a moment longer. Then she put her hand on my forearm, just rested it there, and looked back at the mountains. We sat like that until the light was gone. I don't know how to explain what that meant to me. I'm not a man who explains things like that well. I know what my first wife meant to me, and I don't compare them. That's not how it works. You can't lay one beside the other. What I can say is that in 11 years on that bench land I had been many things: a worker, a freighter, a claim holder, a widower. A man the country used and kept using. But sitting there that evening with her hand on my arm and the mountains going dark, I was something I hadn't been in a long time. I was needed, not because I was the only option, because she had considered her options and chosen. That's different. I said that before, and I'll say it again because it's the thing that matters. The following spring, Roy Torrance rode up to our yard for the first time in his own right, not on a dispute, and asked if I had any mule expertise to spare because he'd come into 3 animals from a debt settlement and he didn't know mules. Bridget was in the yard splitting cedar shakes for the barn roof. He greeted her by name. She greeted him by name back. He watched her work for a moment. She was going at it with the froe and mallet, clean, even splits. And he looked at me and didn't say anything, but the look said something. I went with him and looked at his mules. 2 of them were fine. One had a hoof problem she'd have spotted faster than me, and I thought about mentioning that and decided not to. A man's got to be useful for something. When I got back, she had 1/4 of the shakes done. I said I'd do the other 3/4, and she handed me the froe without argument, which meant she was tired, which she would not have said. I worked until dark, and she brought supper out to the barn, because I was still going. She sat on a bale and watched me eat and said, "The second Torrance boy nodded at me from the road this afternoon." I said, "Did he?" She said, "That's a first." I said, "You've made yourself hard to ignore." She said, "Is that a good thing?" I thought about the first day, standing in that camp with the laugh spreading through the men like fire in dry grass, and the way she'd stood there taking inventory, not flinching, just looking at the country and deciding what she'd gotten herself into. And I thought about what the country had gotten itself into. I said, "It's a good thing." She looked at me for a moment. Then she stood up and took the empty plate and walked back toward the cabin in the last of the light, and the lamp came on in the window a minute later. I went back to work. Outside the barn window, the mountains were there the way they always are, patient and enormous, and not particularly concerned with what happens beneath them. But beneath them, something had taken hold. On 160 acres of bench land above the river, there was a working claim and a kitchen garden coming into its 2nd year, and chickens in the coop and butter from the cold shelf, and a woman who could palm a saddle and read natural history, and stand in a yard full of laughing men and not look at the ground. And there was a man who knew, for the first time in 11 years, that what he'd built was worth the building. Not because a woman had made it pretty, because a good woman had looked at it clearly and looked at him clearly, and decided to stake her life alongside his. That's the thing, that's all of it. You don't get better than that.